After winning the Revolutionary War, America took possession of the land west of the original colonies all the way to the Mississippi River. Many settlers began to move west to have more room for their families and more land for farming. Some people thought they would get rich by finding gold and silver. Others were just interested in moving someplace new. By moving west, the colonists came into conflict with the Native Americans, who had always lived in Kentucky, Tennessee, and other western lands. When the settlers moved west, they saw that the land was fertile for farming. Plantations could now be larger. More land meant more work. Plantation owners wanted more enslaved people to do this work. Slavery soon stretched from the Atlantic Ocean past the Mississippi River all the way to what is now Texas. The expansion of slavery into western territories would create conflict between the North and South. As settlers expanded into new areas, they came into conflict with Native Americans. The American government signed treaties with the Native Americans to protect their lands. However, many settlers moved into these lands anyway. The American government did little to stop the settlers. At the beginning of the 1830s, almost 125,000 Native Americans lived on land in the Southeast. Settlers wanted the Native Americans off these lands. Some states in the Southeast passed laws to try to remove Native Americans from their lands. President Andrew Jackson, who was elected in 1828, promised to remove Native Americans from land that American settlers wanted. In 1830, President Jackson signed a law passed by Congress called the Indian Removal Act. This law gave the federal government the right to take lands held by Native Americans in the Southeast and give them land in the West in return. The Indian Removal Act said that the government had to treat the Native Americans fairly. The law also said that the government could not use force to remove Native Americans from their lands. They did not have to give up their lands if they did not want to. President Jackson ignored these parts of the law. He used the military to force Native Americans from their lands. Starting in May 1838, federal soldiers rounded up 16,000 Cherokee living in the Southeast and marched them to present-day Oklahoma. The conditions were harsh and blankets and supplies were limited. At least 4,000 Cherokee died while traveling. Many were buried in unmarked graves along the way. This forced march of the Cherokee people is known as the Trail of Tears. Other Native Americans were removed from their lands and forced to go to Oklahoma. Some tried to resist removal. The Seminole in Florida fought against the American army. Many people died. Eventually, the Seminole were also removed from their lands. The first enslaved Africans were brought to Virginia in 1619. These enslaved Africans were put to work on the tobacco farms. They were not paid for their work, nor were they free to leave the farms. Tobacco farming took a lot of work. As more farmers grew tobacco, they wanted more enslaved Africans to do the work. Enslaved Africans had no freedom, worked long hours, were bought and sold, and were often punished cruelly. It was a very hard life. As the colonies grew, so did the trading of enslaved Africans. Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans, Louisiana, became busy ports for the ships carrying enslaved Africans to America. Nat Turner. Nat Turner was born into slavery in Virginia. Unlike most enslaved people, he learned how to read and write. He also learned about Christianity. As Turner grew older, he preached to other enslaved people. He told them that God had chosen him to free them from slavery. On August 21st, 1831, Turner led 6 other enslaved people in a rebellion. More than 50 plantation owners and their family members were killed. Turner was captured after hiding out for 6 weeks. Turner and other enslaved people were executed for participating in the rebellion. Harsher new laws were passed to try to prevent future rebellions. Some people used different ways to work to end slavery. Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman escaped slavery and worked as abolitionists to end slavery. Frederick Douglass is best known for his autobiography entitled Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. Douglass traveled throughout the United States and Europe giving lectures about the evils of slavery. He brought attention to the fight to end slavery in the United States. Harriet Tubman escaped slavery in 1849 and later served as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Tubman risked her life to help enslaved people escape the South to freedom in the North. Later, Tubman worked as a spy for the Union Army during the Civil War. Other abolitionists, including the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina. They were born on a plantation in South Carolina to a wealthy family. Even though their family owned enslaved people, the sisters despised slavery and spoke about how cruel it was. Despite opposition, they fought against slavery for the rest of their lives. They also worked for women's rights. In the 1800s, the nation was divided over the issue of slavery. Many in the North opposed this practice, while many in the South depended on slavery to make a living. As the United States pushed westward, the issue of slavery became even more of a problem. Many people in the North did not want slavery to expand into new territories. Most people in the South felt the opposite way. Compromises were made to try to satisfy both sides. Eventually, though, the differences were too great and the country divided in two separate parts. The Confederate States of America. In 1860, the election of Abraham Lincoln as president was a turning point in the fight against slavery. Lincoln was not in support of expanding slavery into the Western territories. Because of his views against the spread of slavery, 7 states from the South seceded or left the United States. Soon, 4 more states also seceded. These 11 states were known as the Confederate States of America. They chose Jefferson Davis as their president. These states drafted a constitution. They raised money and gathered men to fight against the North. This became known as the Civil War. The Civil War. The Civil War began in 1861 when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. The war raged on for 4 long years. It officially ended when Union General Ulysses S. Grant accepted Confederate General Robert E. Lee's surrender in the town of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, on April 9, 1865. At the end of the war, much of the South was in ruins and needed to be rebuilt. 3 amendments to the Constitution were passed as a result of the Civil War. The 13th Amendment was ratified or passed in 1865. It abolished slavery within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. In 1868, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including formerly enslaved people. It provided all citizens with equal protection under the laws. In 1870, the 15th Amendment outlawed states from keeping people from voting on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Reconstruction. Reconstruction was the rebuilding of the South after the Civil War. Although African Americans made some initial gains, Southern states later passed laws to limit their rights. During the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, African Americans would fight for the rights denied to them. For nearly 100 years after the end of slavery, African Americans in many parts of the United States did not enjoy the same rights as white Americans. In some places, African Americans could not go to the same schools as whites or use the same public facilities as whites. Although African Americans had the right to vote, most could not exercise this right. They faced violence and unfair practices like special taxes or tests created to stop them from voting. In response, African Americans, along with white supporters, organized their efforts to secure the rights of African Americans. This movement became known as the Civil Rights Movement. Rosa Parks. In 1955, the law in Montgomery, Alabama said that African Americans had to give up their seats to white passengers on city buses. Rosa Parks, an African American woman, refused to give up her seat and she was arrested. A young black minister named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. helped organize a boycott of the Montgomery bus system. A boycott is refusing to buy or do something as a protest. For 382 days, African Americans did not ride the buses in Montgomery. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregated seating or seating set apart as separate from others was unconstitutional. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. believed in nonviolent protests. On August 28, 1963, Dr. King led more than 200,000 people in the March on Washington. Dr. King delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history. His I Have a Dream speech was a call for Americans to look past the color of a person's skin and instead see their character. Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4, 1968. The struggle continues. As a result of the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law. This act said that race could not be used to deny someone a job. It also gave the federal government the power to make sure public facilities were integrated. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 went even further. The new law banned all voter literacy tests. Despite these laws, discrimination continues. Today, discrimination affects many people, including African Americans, women, LGBT citizens, and other minority groups. People continue to fight for equality in education, employment, and civil rights. In 2018, the Rally to End Racism was held in Washington, D.C. Speakers encouraged the crowd to take a stand against racism and discrimination.